Okay,
Hi,
Robin.
Patrick.
Hi, Robin. How's it going?
Good. It's good to see you again, brother.
Now, correct me, you are getting your master's degree in library science, or you have got your master's degree in library science?
I am in the process of getting my master's degree in library science.
And you also have a master's degree in theology from King's College in London?
History,
History,
with
okay.
with the emphasis, well, historical theology.
Yeah.
So it's both history and theology.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you because it seems like you're in a prime position to be able to comment on this. I've been concerned about the rise in conspiracy theories and fake news recently. How can young people maybe navigate through this maze that we're living in where we don't know what's real and what's not real?
Yeah. Well, being able to, you know, there's no other time in history when we've had access to so much information. And even though we have access to more information than ever before, we are more ignorant in some respects than ever before. And we don't know how to distinguish what's true and what's false, what's real. And well, sorry, what was the other part of your question?
How can young people today navigate through the conflicting maze of narratives? And it might even seem that what's put out by the mainstream news media is even a type of fake news. And maybe they take refuge in, like, we've seen the rise in conspiracy theories like the QAnon stuff. But
Yes.
I've been there on the other side of the computer, and you read these headlines in the major newspapers, and it's like, how do I even know if that's not a kind of fake news as well?
Well, that's a question. And you're right that in reaction to not knowing what's real and what's true, that people do become susceptible to conspiracy. And I'm going to put that in scare quotes because I don't actually think that that's a very helpful term.
Wait, what's that? What's that term again?
I'm going to put conspiracy theories in scare quotes. It's a new type in that. I mean, you can read about it on Wikipedia. Yeah, you're the second person that's asked me about scare quotes. In any event,
I'm getting a lot of I'm getting a lot of feedback on your end, Robin. Just to let you know, it sounds like somebody's talking in the background.
oh yeah. I'm in a coffee shop right now, actually, with good Wi-Fi. Let me put on my earphones, and we can
Okay.
let's see if it's any better with my earphones.
So we're talking with Robin Phillips about the rise in conspiracy theories. And I heard that the term conspiracy theory first became part of popular culture. It was first identified in going over declassified CIA documents where they were talking about how to discredit the Kennedy assassination researchers. And so it was this idea of the CIA to discredit researchers of official accounts. And that was where the term has first been identified, is in these declassified CIA documents where they were talking about how to discredit JFK assassination researchers.
Yes. Are you still getting background noise or now?
But that's fine. I didn't know it was a coffee shop. I thought you were in your office or something. But you were telling us about how you don't think the term conspiracy theories is really that helpful. Can you elaborate on why you don't think that term is helpful?
Yes. Can you hear me all right at the moment? Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you fine. I remember even the BBC, you
Yeah.
know, they ran a story back in the 50s where they were talking about spaghetti trees. And you had many people in England actually writing to the BBC asking if they could buy spaghetti trees because the BBC had convinced them that spaghetti came from a tree. So that would be an example of fake news that would was put out by the mainstream news narrative, a kind of humorous example. But why don't you think
Yes.
that the term conspiracy theory is helpful?
It tends to be used as a pejorative to shut down critical debate and proper due diligence about different ideas. Say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, then it functions like a discussion stopper, just like saying, oh, that's racist. So when you declare that something is, it absolves you from having to look carefully at the truth content of what may or may not be being said. And in a similar way, the term conspiracy theory, it's prejudicial. It judges an idea or truth claim prior to a proper investigation about it. It's a way to beg the question where you argue with premises that already assume you're. So if I
Assuming your
to
conclusion.
declare, oh, that's crazy, because that's a conspiracy theory, is already to have implicitly assumed that it's false.
Can you give
Because
us
the
a,
people who use this as a pejorative.
can you give us an
Pardon me?
example? Can you give us an example of something that would be assuming one's conclusion?
Well, so some examples are the so-called conspiracy theories that are now being talked about in the media, like, and I always say the conspiracies of last year become the mainstream news of this year. And an example of this is I get a mainstream news called The Week that channels the news that's been reported in the main outlets like CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post. And today I got the cover is about the Wuhan leak, that the COVID-19 leaked out of a lab. And as we all know, that was dismissed as a freak conspiracy theory until now it's within the mainline discourse. Another example would be UFOs. You know, you now read about UFOs and potential aliens in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Geoengineering is another. So those would be examples of how at one time these theories were dismissed as merely conspiracy theories, that they're false. The narrative, when you say, oh, that's a crazy conspiracy theory, the narrative that is implicit within that is that it's false, but that because it's a crazy conspiracy theory, you don't have to perform due diligence.
And it's interesting
and
how,
that's a-
how too the babysitters of internet censorship have to do a 180, and they, like Facebook announced on their blog that they would no longer be censoring posts to do with, like you mentioned, the Wuhan lab leak. But you mentioned something earlier about this kind of labeling something as a conspiracy theory as prejudicial, in that it helps you dismiss looking at arguments. But I would actually ask you about judicial precedent, where we can see in the courts that many times people have been convicted for committing conspiracy. And now in the pejorative use of this phrase, they're not even saying conspiracy theory, they're just saying that's conspiracy. And you hear politicians and news people doing this all the time. Oh, that's conspiracy. And it's to do that, you really have to throw out 500 years of judicial history where courts have convicted people for what? For conspiracy. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, I'll take your word for it. I haven't studied the case law to see how
Well,
judicial language is.
I'm speaking
evolving.
generally in the sense that anytime there are two or more people committing a crime, they are committing a conspiracy. If you go poaching deer and you don't have a license, you're committing a crime, and that's a type of conspiracy. So I'm saying that for people to dismiss conspiracies is to dismiss all the illegal activity that we've ever witnessed in history. But I think there's a subtext to what they're saying, in that they're saying that they think you're assuming your conclusion and that your ideas are based on belief, because for them, maybe what you're talking about is just so far out there. Like the other day, a friend of mine said he wanted to send to my email a bunch of stuff about COVID-19. And I said, how is that possible? That's like saying you want to send to my email a bunch of stuff about unicorns. It doesn't exist, but maybe he hasn't read Dr. Stephen Lanka. Yeah.
COVID-19 doesn't exist.
Yeah, I can't say more because I had a video banned recently for summarizing the research of Dr. Stephen Lanka, and I don't want another strike against my account. But yeah, there's some really, even some breakthroughs in science in the last few years, independent laboratory experiments showing that viruses don't exist.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that might be that might be an example of how, when I first approach the subject with people, they assume out of hand that it's a conspiracy theory. But whereas what we're seeing with the global health circus, actually in an epistemological sense, fits the criteria for conspiracy theory, in that we're supposed to accept it on authority, on belief, albeit from the mainstream media, but without any evidence. So they're asking us to assume our conclusions, because anytime you start looking at the evidence, it just falls apart. And I think of many historical events like September 11th and false flag attacks, where they're asking us to believe in miracles, like to believe the official account of September 11th would be to believe in engineering and physics miracles, because buildings don't fall down that way as a result of fire. So the official account actually functions as a conspiracy theory. So them accusing the alternative investigators and the independent journalists, them accusing them of conspiracy theories, is really an example of projection, what psychologists call projection, where you accuse another person of your own faults. And there's no shortcut to good reasoning. So how do we say what's true and what's not true? I would argue that whenever these major events happen in the world, it's necessary to go to independent journalism and alternative media, because we've just had the wool pull over our eyes so many times.
Yes, well, saying that you go to alternative news sources and independent media merely pushes the question back one level, because you would still have to ask, with these sources, how do you evaluate, how do you distinguish what's fake? And
how do you? Are there principles we can use in evaluating whether their news is fake or not?
There are, and that's actually something I've been specializing in grad school. There's a whole library science that is around this very question of how to evaluate information, because many people type about librarians that they're just the people who check out the books to you. A larger library, there's somebody that helps you find the information you need. There's a whole of librarians from view, because they're not the first people you see in the library, but who work in educating students on what's called information literacy, which includes with information.
Can I ask you a question about that just right there? I remember when I was taking English at University, English 101, and we were learning to research. At that time, they said no research from the internet, only research from books. But during that time, the internet was really young. And I've had people tell me that, oh, good research doesn't come over the internet. But could you say that now times have changed where you can really do good research over the internet?
Well, this is one of the things that people misunderstand about the internet. They think of the internet as one place, whereas the internet is actually, so there's the public
Wait,
internet
it was
that's
kind of
available
breaking up.
to-
Can you repeat that last bit? Can you repeat that last thought?
Yeah. I've got a microphone here.
Or maybe
Can you
that's
hear me
better.
all right?
Now I can hear you better.
Yeah. Okay, good.
So the
So-
internet isn't just one thing.
Many, no, it's two things. So there's, and this gets back to your earlier question of how you evaluate what's false. So on the one hand, there's the public part of the internet, which is available to anyone with an internet connection. And then, and that's what people think of as the internet. That's Google, and so the websites we bring up. But then most of the material online, part of internet that goes by various names, called the proprietary web or the licensed web. And these are scholarly resources that academic libraries pay to have access to, scholarly databases, peer reviewed, what we would think, so it used to be that if professors were to publish an article in a peer-reviewed journal, it would be printed physically and it would go out to all the libraries and professors who subscribe to that journal. That's still going on, but it's happening online. Journals, in order to finance themselves, they are available on a subscription basis to universities and businesses that to these journals, or subscribe to the databases that aggregate these journals. And this part of the web, which we'll call the proprietary web, is fundamentally different to the public web. And this is the part that you can access from university libraries and some public libraries in larger cities. Sorry, I forgot the original question you asked.
So
Well, oh yeah, you were asking about doing research on the internet.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
at one time, teachers would say, don't research on the internet, but research on books. Times have changed considerably. And certainly in the STEM subjects, most of the latest research is published in peer-reviewed journals of the proprietary web. In the humanities, it tends to be the and so you have to know how to access this part of the internet. And public internet, the thing that we access when we go onto Google or alternate search engines, this can be very useful. There is a lot of helpful information on the public internet, but you have to know how to the wheat from the chaff. You have to know how to separate what's true and what's fake. And there are some techniques that you can use. I actually have a list of them. If you're interested, I'll just give you two or three. Go to the top level of a domain. When you open the web page that you found, say through a Google search, go to the home page, read about the people who write for the website, see if there are any reviews of the website. That's one thing you can do.
That's one of the things that's one of the things I like doing. For example, if I'm researching a topic, I like to see what other people are saying about that subject I'm researching.
Exactly, exactly. And then another thing you can do is you can read both sides, because even on a contentious where you're going to get different viewpoint, say it's something political, you're going to get a different viewpoint from CNN versus Fox News versus Breitbart. By reading around the different perspectives, you get a feel for the landscape of the dispute, and that can be very helpful in
Breitbart,
making up your own mind. And on
Breitbart though has had some fake news, because remember in one of your videos that you made a while ago about fake news, you mentioned a guy who wrote an article for uneducated conservatives about like a ship off of New York being captured having drugs that was tied to the Clinton Foundation, and it was exposed as fake news, and that was actually carried on Breitbart. So there's sometimes that fake news.
yes, well, that's why it's
even
important.
makes it onto semi reputable websites.
Yeah, that's why it's important to do fact checking. Now, fact checking has a kind of bad name because it can be a subset of ideology. But if there's something that is published that is patently false, that is just somebody made it up, you can be pretty sure about 24 hours, someone will have exposed it. Someone will have written a review. So Google is an incredibly powerful tool for fact checking if you use it properly. So whenever anybody sends me a link or a video, I don't care where it's from, who's published it, my default assumption is that it's fake, and the reasons why it might be true. I always start by assuming that what somebody has sent me is fake, because I've been taken in, just like we all have, by fake news.
I actually find that find that now it's harder to use Google for this because of the censorship. So for example, 5 or 6 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, I would be able to read an article, say on like one of these alternative journalist websites, but I would be able to, like, if they mention something in there, I would be able to do a Google search and find out what other people are saying about it. And it was a lot easier to trace back original sources. But now that Google doesn't want people even researching these stuff, and they want to be the babysitters, they've changed their algorithms. So it's a lot harder. So like, for example, if I used to read something on Alex Jones and I wanted to find what other people were saying about this on message boards, or even try to go back to the original sources, that was a lot easier before, because of the internet censorship, it is lost that naturalness that Google used to have, used to be more of a democratized space, if you know what I mean. So I actually find that it's a lot
absolutely.
harder. It's a lot harder now to research.
It is. It is. And even apart from ideology, people can manipulate Google just through good search engine optimization practices. And that's why it's good to have search engines that you use. So when I open up my Firefox web browser, I have it set to go to DuckDuckGo.
That's the one I use.
Search engine.
I like
when I
that
open
one.
up Chrome. Yeah. And when I open, it goes to Google. So I will use both search engines to find things out. Another thing I will do is when I'm reading an article about something, I will look up the sources that they quote. So if somebody is a speech that Biden gave or something, I will go and then look for that speech so I can see things in context. That's very important, seeing things in context. And sometimes, then that's actually something that Google is very good at. If you have a fragment of something from a speech or a document that a source is quoting, you can put that into Google, and 9 times out of 10, the original source. And to make sure that something's an original source, you always want to go to the top level of the domain. So you edit the URL so you can go back to the home page and then see what the website is. You interact with different types of websites differently. The way you would interact with the university website is different than a government website, is different than a website that's which is different than a blog. And you have to know how to evaluate these different types of publications in a different way when you're doing fact checking and due diligence.
Okay, that's great, Robin.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for sharing these insights. Talk to us about your new book on gratefulness.
Could I say a little?
Oh yeah.
Could we just wrap up? Could I talk a little bit about epistemology?
A little bit about what?
Epistemology.
Oh yeah, epistemology. The theory of knowledge. Yeah. Go ahead.
And can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I'm getting some static.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Talk to us about epistemology. Now I can't hear you. The theory of knowledge, epistemology.
So I've noticed, I did a little experiment last year where somebody would send me a link to an article or a video or a conspiracy theory. There's a lot of stuff going on about QAnon. I did a little experiment, and for about I would reply to friends saying, thank you for sharing this with me. I will be performing due diligence on it. Would you like to be part of the due diligence process with me? Would you like to help me investigate if what you've sent me is true? And it was interesting. Nobody replied that they wanted to be involved in the process of due diligence that I was performing on the source that they sent me.
Okay,
and quite a number of people.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
What would that look like? Okay, so for example, let's make it really practical. I've been going over some papers by this German doctor, Dr. Stefan Lanka, who's reviewing the polio and the measles studies that were done in the 50s. And he's going over those original documents. He's even doing laboratory research now to try to fill in the gaps. And his conclusion is that polio and measles don't exist. How could I, applying your techniques of due diligence, do better research when I'm going over the writings of Dr. Stefan Lanka?
Well, the methods that I used don't apply to science and chemistry. They apply more to media. So the methods that you would use for chemistry research, which is, I assume, what this is beyond me. But you could probably find out in chemistry textbooks and so forth. But I'm not a science person, so I'm not able to help you. I can tell you the methods I used when evaluating things from the media and the news, which is mainly what people were sending me in 2020. And I developed a toolkit, And one of the things the first thing in my toolkit was, I've already mentioned this, browse a website before trusting its content. You want to ask questions like, how is it funded? Who are the writers on this website? Is the content market driven? Is it ideologically driven, and so forth? Then the other best I follow is test information by checking multiple sources. The third prong in my toolbox is become familiar with both sides of an issue. And we talked about that. Number 4, check for grammar errors. Sometimes if there are spelling and grammar errors on the website, that is a dead giveaway. That's amateurish publication, which doesn't mean that what they're saying is false. That would be an ad hominem fallacy. But spelling and grammar errors, you can think, okay, maybe I should look at this a little closer. None of this proves whether something is true or false, but it can, taken in the aggregate, these can be. Number 5 is use Wikipedia for fact checking. Now, I know Wikipedia gets a lot of bad rap, but on matters of fact, objective fact, is if rather on non-controversial, it can be it's very accurate because of the refereeing system that they use. Number 6 is look for context. There's a way of approaching questions where you ask questions about the context. You look at different issues and questions that are adjacent to the particular issue that you're researching. One of those, when it comes to just a very basic example, like a quote, is where was this quote published? What were other things wrote? How passage been understood by the scholars, and so forth. 7 is learn to distinguish journalism from curation. Is this person an actual journalist, or is he aggregating together sources that he's derived from elsewhere, rather than actually engaging in primary research himself? Another is number 8.
I want to stop you there, because I think that sometimes the best journalists are the journalists that are able to take all different news stories and connect the dots and piece them together. In fact, I would say that that's what we call scoops. And there's a give and take and a back and forth between what's fake news and what's scoops, because many times scoops, when they first come out, are rejected and they're considered to be fake news. And many times things that start out and they're assumed to be scoops, later we find out that they are fake news. And sometimes scoops never make it into the mainstream discourse. And I feel like we have, in many ways, a breakaway civilization where the popular narratives have been hijacked, and everything that people talk about is media generated, even in a fake sense. So sometimes it's necessary to actually ask ourselves, what would the media landscape look like if the media actually told the truth? It would look very different.
Yes, indeed. Well, and it isn't so. Just to clarify, when I distinguished between journalism and it isn't that one is good and the other is bad, but you need to know what type of genre you're dealing with, because the method of evaluating it will be different. For example, if is claiming something based on his own personal investigation, that will be evaluated differently than if he is simply regurgitating what he and his assistants have found on the internet. That's called curation. And in that, he's curating, he's bringing together sources
like a
that he's
commentary,
found.
like a commentary.
Yes, kind of. And so in that case, you want to go and look at the sources that the person is drawing from, and evaluate them their own terms. And many people don't appreciate this difference between primary journalism and curating other people's journalism. And another thing, number 8, is you apply logic to evaluators. I had people who were, one day they would send me something saying that COVID-19 did not exist, and another day they would send me something saying that it was made in a Chinese lab. Well, by using logic, you can recognize that both those statements can't be true at the same time. If it doesn't exist, it can't also have been created in a laboratory. And so by using a little logic and critical thinking can help you, especially when you're dealing with multiple information sources.
Okay,
Um,
I really,
yes?
I really love your idea about using the academic resources that are on the internet and also going back to primary sources. Both of those things is why I've been helped so much these last couple of years by the talks of Dr. Andy Kaufman, who is a forensic investigator. He's an expert witness in the field of psychiatry. And he reviews the original studies for like the SARS and of which COVID-19 was based, everything about the genetic sequencing. And when there's a new study, he reviews it and he employs many of these techniques saying, oh, well, let's assume this for the sake of argument. And since I'm not going to be actually going and reading through all those original studies, I'm very happy to have somebody like Dr. Andy Kaufman reviewing those studies and helping to mitigate against the panic and the hysteria. But would that be an example of curation?
Possibly, I'd have to look at his text, but if he, I really, I really don't know without seeing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it sounds like yeah, it sounds like he's going through a lot of the scientific journals and studies and helping to kind of demystify it for a non-specialist.
Yeah. Can I ask you about?
Could be very.
Can I ask you about your book on gratefulness, gratitude in life's trenches?
Yes, certainly. I just have one more of the one more tool in my toolkit of how I evaluate, which I want to just share first. And this really, because this really gets back to some of maybe the darker side of conspiracy theories, and that is about or intellectual virtues. There are habits of mind or attitudes that are upstream of properly being able to use information. And one of the concerns I have about, I'm not going to use conspiracy theories in a prejudicial way, because I've already the problematic use of the term. But one of the things we find when people realize that the mainstream media has been lying to them, it's easy to then not trust anything. It's easy to then become to alternative news sources that claim everything from the fact that there wasn't a moon landing to that the earth is flat. And I know people who believe that the earth is flat, very smart people. And often what you find when you interact with these types of people who they'll say, I can't trust anything. I'm not even going to believe that the earth is round
By the way,
unless I can prove it for myself.
I would have to include myself as one of those people who do not believe the moon landing was real. But
Okay. I thought you were going to say about, I thought you were going to say you're a flat earther.
I don't want to sidetrack, so I just want to clarify that.
Okay.
Okay, but go on.
Okay. Thank you. Well, often when I try to engage, and not just me, but other people try with this mentality that, okay, I'm not going to believe that that overlaps with the mainstream narrative. You often find a sense of the intellectual virtues, and intellectual are the habits of mind and attitudes that are prior to or upstream of us being able to evaluate information properly. I'm just going to read you some. One is non-dismissive consideration of opposing arguments, charitable interpretation of opposing arguments, carefulness to weigh up different points of view, including listening to opposing points of view with cognitive elasticity, curiosity, thoughtfulness, awareness of one's presuppositions for potentially being attentiveness, honesty, fair-mindedness, tenacity, love of truth, intellectual humility, courage. These are all habitudes which have to be in place if we are going to properly interact with information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. You've given us a lot to think about.
And one of the things that concerned me was last year when I would interact with friends and say, thank you for sharing this link with me. I'm going to be performing due diligence. True. I would often get the feedback that, it's just a matter of belief whether we think it's true, or you can't fact check. Fact checking is an anachronism in the age of Google. It just all comes down to what you choose to believe. And one of the reasons that I'm developing this toolkit of steps people can go through in evaluating information is to help people realize, no, it doesn't do what you just choose to believe, because we can actually perform objective due diligence. We can engage in an investigation using the tools, the online tools that are available to us. And often I find I get a lot of pushback from even conservative Christians who would repudiate the idea of relativism. People who would repudiate the idea of epistemological relativism will tell me, oh, that just all comes down to your perspective. Everything is biased. Everyone has their agenda. Everything's biased.
I think that's a shortcut for also saying conspiracy theory. They think that you're starting with belief. But okay, somebody like me who's
but many people will present it as normative. It's become something that
I think there's a subtext involved in that they think that you haven't done the research. But go on. I'm sorry, I keep interrupting you. I did want to say one thing though.
No, that's fine.
If you do fact checking,
oh yes,
you're going to find that asking questions about climate change and global warming is considered fake news. And as someone who's looked at this issue deeply, I can tell you that I don't like going to Wikipedia and seeing some of my favorite journalists up there on Wikipedia's list of fake news websites. Why? Because they've asked questions about climate change. And maybe these are websites and journalists who believe that climate change is real, but they question how it's being used politically. or other journalists who have asked questions about geoengineering, how we can blame carbon emissions for climate change when, according to military documents, they've been tinkering and controlling the weather since the debate has began. So it's a lot more nuanced than the Google fact checkers make it out to be. So I think I'm a little bit
Exactly.
more suspicious of the mainstream narratives, or maybe not, but
Yes.
I do feel
Well, you can.
I do feel like we are in a sense living in a post-truth world because of the current media landscape.
Agree with that. That's a very good observation. And when people were telling me that due diligence is neither possible nor desirable for the post-truth mentality, like I said before, people were saying, oh, it just all comes down to what you believe. Everyone has their bias, so I'm just choosing the bias that fits with you. And this to attack wanting to perform due diligence on the information that they were sending me. And I know I was intentionally annoying. I mean, it's not every day you send somebody a video and he texts back and says, performing due diligence on this, would you like to be part of that process with me? But it was interesting to me that the reactions I got was not just, oh, I don't have time, let me know what you find out, but that no, due diligence is impossible. King is an anachronism now. And this so but yeah, your point about, I wouldn't trust Wikipedia and things like climate or evolution.
I just want to say one thing. You're in North Idaho, and I recently read a article about how in Idaho it's now the political fight is between the right and the radical right, and so there's a lot of radicalization that's going on in your state, for better or for worse. It's known for.
Yeah, there's a lot of radicalization. I'll just give you an example. I was going on the hike earlier this year, last week, in fact. Um, I'm going to be vague because I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. But I was going on the hike, and the person that I was hiking with told me that he listens to. He's a Catholic, and he listens to speeches of Hitler while he does the rosary. So he's praying the rosary to speeches of Hitler because he wants to have his passions aroused against liberals so that he can really attain to the far right ideal, which is really neo-Nazism. I'm not going to sugarcoat my words. And that was not an event. I encounter a lot of far right Nazism in North Iowa, and it's usually propelled by people who want to be gullible to the sources that support their particular bias, and who will get pushback against the very idea of checking, the very idea of an objective investigation on contentious truth claims.
Wow. Okay. What was the other question I asked you? I think I've asked you a few times about your book on gratefulness, Gratitude in Life's Trenches.
Oh yes, thank you for being patient while I went through my toolbox.
You got it. So one of the things that I took away from the little bit that I read was, when we're hit with troubles, when we're hit with turmoils, if we fight against it, it doubles our pain. So you use the analogy of a guy who's in a cold, dark dungeon, and one guy is banging against the wall, screaming, "Let me out, let me out." Well, the other guy just sits down and can't do anything about it. Maybe he does yoga or whatever. But by fighting against the bad things that come to us, we're actually doubling the pain.
Yes, yes, there's a principle in psychology that if we lean our trials rather than pushing against them, then they injure us less. And Saint Dorotheus of Gaza talked about, the ancient church father talked about this. Just the example of a swimmer who a wave is coming towards him. If he crashes against the wave, it's going to clobber him. But if he just ducks down and that passes over him, then he won't murder. Yeah, or like the person in the dungeon. One person is banging at the door, "Let me out, let me out." The other person is just sitting down and accepting the situation. So when we respond to our trials with a sense of acceptance, leaning into them rather than resisting them. And we can do that because we know that God doesn't send us anything our way that doesn't have the potential for us to spiritually. He doesn't anything in any trial that God brings to us. We have the potential based on how we respond to it to grow spiritually through that. And that's why we're ultimately able to have substances.
How did you
That's
get?
what I was trying to. One of the
Yeah.
things.
How did you get interested in this topic? Gratitude in life's trenches.
Well, Patrick, I never set out to actually initially to write a book about gratitude, but there was a kind of a constellation of a lot of different factors in my life that were pointing this direction, and I decided to gather together all my notes into a book, and so I'd been doing some behavioral health industry for a learning platform, psychologists to pass their licensure exam. So after a psychologist gets a PhD, they still can't start practicing. They have to take a licensure exam, and it's very hard.
Why didn't you take the licensure exam? Be a psychologist.
Well, only people with that you have to have a PhD in psychology in order to take the licensure exam. So I sent on the exam, and I still wouldn't have been able to open the clinic as a psychologist, at least. But while I was working for this company, I was in the marketing department, which content for their website, search engine optimization. This is one of the reasons, as I alert to Google's bias and how they influence us, because I actually worked on the other side of that. I worked in our content for the search engines to manipulate our results. So not manipulate. That's a bad term within the SEO world. But I was kind of hand about what I could write about, as long as it was kind of related to the psychology and learning side of things. And so that the way for me to explore, to become interested 5 or 10 years ago, attitude, reframing, neuroplasticity, how the choices that how we choose usually alters the and forms in the brain, and so then I I was doing work at some travels to monasteries and so forth around the same time, and reading in the Orthodox spiritual tradition, and I was very impressed by the confluence, the alignment in some of these advances in contemporary psychology and neuroscience and ancient spiritual traditions. And so I just started exploring kind of the interface between ancient and modern psychology, neuroscience, and kind of out of that, as well as out of some other factors, including my interest in history in there, from some of the figures in history that
Great.
inspiration.
And I'll have to get you back for an entire show just about that book. But just before I let you go, I wanted to ask you about, you describe yourself in some of your articles as a recovering Gnostic. You've even written about
Yes, Gnosticism.
confessions of a recovering Gnostic. What do you mean by Gnosticism?
Well, thank you. But that is a good question, because Gnosticism is kind of used to cover a multitude of sins. And I just use Gnosticism in a very broad sense to mean pessimism about the physical world, an inability to understand how our spiritual lives and our physical lives interrelate.
Can you give an
I'm
example?
a recover.
Can you give an example of how maybe you might have before had some Gnostic ideas, or maybe some Gnostic ideas in contemporary Christianity where we might least expect them?
Well, it's very easy, and I've fallen victim to this, of having your spiritual life in one compartment and then your secular life in another, and without really any clear sense of how the spiritual life relates to our experience in the physical world. I mean, well, how does theology relate to purifying water, to organic gardening, to what we put on the table, and so forth? These are questions that are hard to ask when our theology has been tinctured with Gnostic type assumptions.
Okay.
After, go ahead.
You talk a lot about Plato, and you talk about how Plato actually evolved through his relationship with Aristotle. But would Plato have been considered a Gnostic?
Well, that's a really interesting question. For a long time, I considered Plato to be a kind of proto-Gnostic. Plato was writing before Gnosticism emerged as a movement, but there's no question that the Gnostics drew on Plato's philosophy, particularly his idea that the physical world is just the realm of shadows that we want to escape from in order to go to forms that's immaterial. But in some sense, that's an oversimplification of Plato's philosophy, because he did mature over his life, influence of his down-to-earth student Aristotle. Aristotle was much more, dad had been a physician, and if you want to understand the meaning of a horse, you don't just hoarseness, you get your hands dirty dissecting and observe the horse. So Aristotle was responsible for early version of what method, and it seems that Aristotle influenced Plato, because in Plato's later life, he is talking good, true, and beautiful world as a ladder by which we can ascend to the heavenly realm. So So when we see a beautiful form in a beautiful physical form, it's not in his later life. It's not just that, oh, this is an illusion that's taking our sight down to the earth, but no, this is a shadow of a higher beauty that we can ascend to as we as we contemplate the good, the true, and the beautiful, good, true, and beautiful things in this world can help us to contemplate what is beyond this world. And this was picked up by Saint Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, who kind of Christianized Plato's philosophy within a theological
Yeah,
context.
yeah. In fact, the fathers,
That's a very big subject, and
the fathers of the church used Plato to explain the incarnation and all that. But I just want to ask you about the resurrection of the body, because when I was looking over your articles on this subject, you said that the belief, the hope in the resurrection of the body is absolutely fundamental to understanding our walk as Christians. Why is the belief in the resurrection,
this.
the hope in the resurrection, so important?
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, St. Paul didn't have the hope of resurrection. We are most miserable. You know, when Jesus rose from the dead, completely he could defeated death, and you know we hear that, but we don't often understand really what it means. So the resurrection life has been injected into humanity, so that there's the the old order of sin and corruption is passing away, and will one day be completely done away with as God world, and to enjoy perfect fellowship with Him in the new heavens and the new earth. And this has started with the resurrection of Christ, and it's our physical bodies that will be raised from the dead. The church fathers and the biblical authors were very clear about we will be embodied beings in the resurrection. Now it would be a different type of physicality. We won't be subject to the death principle and to pain and so forth. But God is deeming the very stuff of the material world, and this is very clear in the Orthodox Christian teaching and so forth. But it tends to be sometimes eclipsed and much Protestant evangelicalism, and which is the tradition that I came out of. And you're completely right. I call myself a recovery.
Can I give you an example? So a lot of the times when I'm talking with evangelicals about orthodoxy, they object to the physical expressions of our worship, like crosses and icons, because there's this innate idea that we have to have this invisible spiritual connection, and this even influences their ecclesiology, where they see the church as comprised of these invisible spiritual bonds, but without any kind of tangible framework or tangible structure, because there is this idea that the material things are bad, and you even get into kind of ecclesiological Nestorianism. Is there anything like that you'd like to comment about that?
Yeah, well, I don't really have anything to add to what you've just said. You know, it is a problem. People walk into a Orthodox church enough. You see us using our body, like we're crossing ourselves, kneeling. They'll see icons, and it will seem very, quote unquote unspiritual when you have this dualism, the spirit and the body. Um, but and that dualism used to be very strong within my thinking, and it goes back in many ways to the who founded America, or who were seminal in the New England states, at least. And much of American approaches to spirituality tincture the Puritanism. And the Puritans' chief philosopher, Jonathan Edwards, was very explicit that we grow spiritually to the degree that we less at home in our physical physical bodies. Now, there's a sense in which we can affirm that in the Orthodox sense. The physical body that we have now is subject and is the vehicle of sin. But what we are looking forward to in the resurrection is a redeemed physicality, a material body that is animated not by the fall but by God's Spirit. And I'm sorry, there's a lot of background noise here, so
Yeah.
I want to, just before we go, maybe I could ask you a question. Could I ask you a question?
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I know you teach in Ecuador, and I know with the closures, it must be difficult. Have you managed to pick up any new classes since they opened up a bit, or have things started to open up in Ecuador?
Well, they open up, but then they close again. And we're teaching, I'm teaching one class a week now for 4 hours on Friday afternoons. But
Oh, okay.
the tourist industry has just been absolutely devastated, gutted. And there's a lot of hardship as a result of the entire economy is just in the toilet. And you know,
I'm sorry to hear that.
most of the language academies in Ecuador have actually closed. I'm fortunate to be one that's still kind of trying to hang on, but it's hard. It's not that they're prohibited from coming. They were before. But now the problem is that people are too afraid to come and want to study. The people, they've gotten used to studying online. And a lot of people don't have money now because everybody's suffering. So I've actually seen this as economic terrorism, because if you put scares into the economy that aren't justified, that is economic terrorism. And that's actually punishable under the law. So again, we're back to this thing, is it justified or not? And that's why I think it's so important to go back to the sources on a lot of these things, review the original studies. And the more I look at it, the more I'm seeing that virology is just dogma. It's like a religion and science. So this seems to be played out every 10 years, every 12 years, over and over again, with every time stepping it up, and every time is building and becoming worse and worse and worse. So I would just encourage it. Part of due diligence that I think is important is actually going and asking more fundamental questions like, do these diseases even really exist? But a lot of people are too skeptical to even want to do the research, much less watch a speech by Dr. Peter Duesberg or something like that. But I always tell the people, and I know doctors here, and I always tell them the quickest way to unmasking the current global health circus is looking at the PCR test. And we're not going to talk about that because we did a conversation about that a year ago, and it was banned from YouTube, wasn't it?
Indeed.
Yeah. And you were just encouraging people to do research. You actually took the official account of, you were cautioning, with a cancel everything, go to your houses, and you since said that you walk back a little bit from that. But I put that video on an alternative video hosting website, and I'm not even allowed to link to it from there on Facebook. So it's really the digital medieval equivalent of a book burning, the digital mob. And I think we're headed into a new dark age. But I'm looking to doing other things. I'm wedded to staying in Ecuador, but not necessarily as a teacher. I hope things are going to open up, but everybody's still walking around with masks on. I'm acting normal, but hardly anyone else is. And not every place in Ecuador is the same. In the mountains, they're a lot more uptight than they are on the coast. But I'm thankful for the
It's
little
encouraging to
bit of classes I have.
hear that you're being normal.
Yeah, I've tried to be normal throughout.
Yes, I'm very encouraged to hear that
Yeah,
you're being normal.
and but these last 2 years have actually made me rethink what is normal, because I see people walking around in ways that are not normal, and that actually anytime before, it was illegal to get on a bus with a mask on, because they would assume you were the Lone Ranger or a robber or something, El Zorro. But now I'm seeing the whole world acting in ways that are not normal, but normal has been redefined as doing whatever everybody else is doing. So sometimes, like, I've been in the store with people and then we're going to walk outside, and somebody there, my friend is standing outside, and they say, "Oh, I don't have my mask on," because they're not even thinking anymore. And if you've had COVID-19 once, doesn't that make you immune? So people aren't using their brains, but it's made me have to rethink what is being normal. Because before, people would tell me, "Patrick, you think everything is bad because I want to eat my own salt. I don't want to eat white sugar. And I don't want to have a lot of EMF radiation." And they say, "Oh, Patrick, everything is bad for you." But it's because I wanted to care for my health. But now I'm in the position of saying, no, everybody needs to go to the beach, and everybody's in their house paranoid, which again gets back to this post-truth world. I think there is a type of relativism that kicks in where being normal can change one day to the next just based on whatever's coming over the idiot blocks.
Yeah, very peculiar times in which we live. That's for sure.
The media can be very deceptive, but I'm glad we have people like you to help us sort the wheat from the chaff. And it's been a pleasure one more time. And I want to say thank you.
Thank you for having me on your. Thank you for.
Okay. Great.
Thank you.